that we're approaching 2 o'clock. So let's start. Good afternoon if you're in Europe. Good morning if you're in Washington, D.C. And good evening in Asia and India. I'm Jonas Parello-Plesner. I'm Executive Director of the Alliance of Democracies Foundation here in Copenhagen in Europe. So it's fantastic to kick off our first sort of virtual session on how democracies and autocracies handle the coronavirus. I am here joined by two great panelists, Julie Smith, Director at German Marshall Fund, Tobby Simon, President and founder of Synergia Foundation. I'll introduce both of my co-panelists shortly. But I also just wanted to welcome all of you out there following this session on Facebook Live or other means. This is our inaugural session, so bear with me and the team if we should experience any sort of technical mishaps. Let me also initially express my thoughts and sympathies with all the people suffering around the world due to the virus. My sympathy goes especially out to anybody listening who themselves are infected with coronavirus or who has family members or close relatives who are. This is a difficult time for all of us around the globe. So our theme today is on how democracies and autocracies handle the spread of the virus. It all started in China, in Wuhan in December, but has subsequently spread globally, and countries are in very different sort of stages of handling the virus. Let me also mention for all of you following out there that you can ask questions, which you can do either on our Facebook Live page, or you can do it at Twitter, at our Twitter handle, at AO Democracies, where you can ask questions as well. So the virus does not only strain our health systems, it also strains our sort of shared democratic values. Freedom of movement and assembly has, of course, been curtailed in these sort of worldwide lockdowns. And governments, sometimes with full transparency and sometimes none at all, are using electronic tracking and health data collection to spot and follow infected citizens. Some leaders are using this moment to consolidate power. In Europe, Hungary, of course, sort of stands out in that regard. But we all, of course, want to come out of this crisis alive, but we also want our political systems of freedom and democracy to survive. So those are some of the questions where I'll turn to our speakers to provide a snapshot, first of all, from where they are based in the world's two largest democracies, India and the US. And secondly, their thoughts on whether our democratic traditions will be damaged more permanently by the way we sort of the political crisis following this virus. And then sort of course, the question of the day, how they see democracies versus autocracies handle this. China, which was the original epicenter, has been quick to reverse the tables and now is sort of selling its authoritarian model of control as the right and efficient response to the virus. There's no denying that some democracies do look messy in their handling of the virus currently. Still, sort of research in The Economist that I wanted to bring to people's attention. I think we can see the graph here, shows that diseases or let me share a screen maybe, or I can, here it is. This here shows from The Economist one block two system, as it says, like, and that diseases like COVID-19 are deadlier in non-democracies, even though China claims otherwise. So I think that was just an interesting piece of, let me just make sure people can see it here again from The Economist in their February edition. On the other hand, we had Francis Fukuyama, who wrote in the Atlantic the paper recently, and his idea was actually on that same question on democracies and autocracies, and his thoughts were that it wouldn't as much be a dividing line between democracies and autocracies per se, but more a question of countries where public trust in government was high and therefore was easier to sort of get through the crisis with the sort of public's trust. But let me turn to Julie Smith first. Julie, you're in confinement in Washington, DC, but your day job is still with the German Marshall Fund, where you're directing the Asia program. German Marshall Fund is a think tank dedicated to the transatlantic relationship. You have an illustrious background in national security, having worked in the Pentagon and later on in the White House being a close advisor to then Vice President Joe Biden. So you've had your share of situation room experiences with sort of international crises. So we would love to hear sort of initially your thoughts on these topics.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Thanks for all of you for joining us today from many different locations throughout Europe, as I understand it, from Asia, and hopefully a few from North America as well, even though it's a little bit early here in Washington. I'll just spend just a few minutes talking about the situation here, and then I want to jump into this debate about autocracies versus democracies, and just give you a couple of perspectives before we jump into a discussion after we hear from Tobby. So you mentioned, I think, Jonas, you used the word messy at one point in your opening remarks, and I think that's a pretty good description of what's happened here in the United States over the last couple of weeks. We've had a slow start here in the United States. We knew it was coming. We knew the virus would eventually hit our shores. But I think there was a lot of hoping that maybe it wouldn't, or that we could cover it up. We have a president that does not have a lot of faith in our institutions or our press, or sometimes even in science, to be honest. And so initially, I think the instinct was to keep the public calm, keep the markets calm, try and portray the administration as having full confidence that they could tackle the virus, and diminish the threat to society. As time has gone on, you've seen the president and his team go through various twists and turns. There have been a lot of course corrections. They have formed a task force, something that they did not do right off the bat, but that did happen. And now the Vice President, Mike Pence, is leading the charge. We had a situation where there was some hesitancy to even talk about numbers or the danger of doing things like shaking hands or convening in large numbers. We had a swing there where the president was very relaxed about social gatherings and then became much more serious in his warnings to the American public. We've also had cases where the administration was hesitant to put emergency measures in place. One example of that would be the Defense Production Act, which allows the government to essentially instruct or force industry to respond to the crisis, particularly for the production of emergency equipment. The president initially said he was going to move forward and put the Defense Production Act into practice, but then failed to do that. Weeks later, then he actually did it. And now we have a situation where our industrial partners are responding. We have companies like General Motors now producing parts that go into ventilators. So the best way to describe kind of how the United States has responded is definitely messy and slow, but due to various course corrections, we've seen a shift. The question is, how much time have we lost, and what kind of impact will that lost time actually have on public health? The last thing I'll say about the United States is the obvious, that everybody on this call knows, and that it's a large country with 50 different states that have governors and local leaders that are taking different approaches. We have had some national guidance, but not enough. And so what you see in the United States right now are big differences among the states, where some states are in complete lockdown, or cities, and others are either disregarding guidance or trying to cover up what they really should be doing. We had a situation in Florida just this past weekend where a pastor was still holding church with his very large congregation. And so you can see the differences of approaches there, partly because the virus is dramatically affecting different parts of the country in different ways, with New York and the West Coast as the two big epicenters. And then the center of the country kind of starting to feel the impact, but the severity of it obviously really varies. So what this has all done is trigger a debate around the world, not only about the United States, but about how democracies in general are handling the virus. And I think folks have been really quick to reach the conclusion that somehow autocracies can handle it much better and democracies are worse off because of the sloppiness and the messiness with which they've been handling this. I think the cartoon version is that a country like China has full control. It can cordon off a whole portion, millions of people in the population, and take very extreme draconian measures to isolate the population and isolate the virus. Whereas democracies have a harder time putting those types of measures in place or are hesitant to bump up against civil liberties. We also have a situation where autocracies are under no obligation, obviously, to be transparent about what's happening. And so they can put out misinformation or disinformation, not only to their own publics about what's happening inside the country, but also to the wider world. And that is something that we've seen China pursuing quite aggressively in the last couple of weeks, particularly in Europe, because it has been donating large number of supplies to European partners, whether it's masks or testing kits, and it's doing its best to take those donations and portray them as a situation where China now is emerging as the global leader in managing this virus. This is a role traditionally that's been reserved for the United States. You'll remember with the Ebola crisis, it was the Obama administration that was able to convene a group of international partners to tackle this crisis, despite the fact that Ebola was not on our shores. The United States naturally stepped into that leadership role. This administration is not assuming that role. In fact, in many ways, it's abdicating that traditional leadership role. And so that's an opportunity for China to walk through the door and portray itself as the global leader. Now, what I think is happening is, while initially that narrative was very appealing and easy to latch onto, I think many countries around the world now are stepping back and saying, wait a minute, first of all, some of the testing kits that you're delivering are in fact faulty. Some of the masks that you're delivering are not as effective. And we're not sure that we want to fold into this wider narrative about China being the global power. The reality is, or the global leader on this crisis, the reality is that it's far too soon for us to judge how democracies versus autocracies are handling this. We do have situations where we're seeing some portions of the public in China pushing back on how China has handled the virus. There were people that were breaking through censors, putting out messages and videos on social media and various other technological forms of communication to try and get the truth out there. There is evidence in democracies that they're finally getting a grip on the crisis. The EU was very slow to react, but now is getting into the game and trying to at least serve as a better coordinator on some of the assistance out there, and also taking credit for some of what either individual European countries are doing or the European Union is doing. So I would say, instead of reaching some sort of firm conclusion about where this is all headed, what we have before us actually are a series of really tough questions that we don't know the answers to. And those have to do primarily with how much freedom societies are going to be willing to sacrifice in the future to ensure their own public health and their security and safety, how countries and governments are going to manage, which will no doubt be a looming debt crisis and financial crisis that's going to hit us like a tsunami, and what types of choices countries are going to have to make between addressing their debt and making other investments that are important, whether you're looking at defense budgets or other aspects of public spending. Lastly, there are big questions about how we're going to handle borders. questions like surveillance. And then the biggest question for me is kind of the societal impact. How will we as societies react to each other? We in the United States have seen an uptick in incidents of kind of anti-Asian, anti-Chinese behavior, comments, discrimination, some very troubling incidents. I think that's playing out in real time in a lot of societies right now. So questions about how it's going to affect xenophobia, nationalism, populism, the far right, these are all things that will take us time to digest, because we are literally watching this unfold in real time. So with that, just a couple of thoughts, and I look forward to the discussion today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julie, and once again, thank you for getting up early in Washington, D.C. to bring in your perspectives. And now I can move to India and move to the late afternoon in Bangalore. So I have with us here next on our panel is Tobby Simon, who is the president and founder of Synergia Foundation. That's an independent think tank in Bangalore. We've been collaborating earlier on questions around election interference, cyber issues, but actually as we plan to do this, I've realized with your sort of long background and different, you've also been advising the WHO, and you've been actually working on pandemics in different stages in your career. But I do think India, being the world's largest democracy, but at the same time, it's also, of course, still a country under development. And as some of the things I just read up on India, of course, saying to street vendors, you have to stay home, doesn't really make sense if your work is on the street. So I think it's, of course, the lockdown that's unprecedented and India has instituted creates a completely new situation in not just a democracy, but also a developing country. So again, hearing your perspectives from India, Toby, would be really interesting.
Thank you, Jonas. A very good morning, good afternoon, and evening to all of you. Let me first share some good news. I will go to the India part a little later when the Q&A comes up. But let me share some good news. A Belgian woman, Suzanne Helerts, aged 90, died of COVID-19 after refusing a respirator, telling a doctor, "Save this one for the youngest who need it most. I have already had a beautiful life." So it's a very nice message which I heard this afternoon. And it's indeed a great pleasure interacting with you. And I want to thank Jonas, Parello-Plesner, the Executive Director of Alliance for Democracy, and Julie Smith, the Director of the Asia Program German Marshall Fund, for organizing this roundtable. It's a real privilege to share the dais remotely with you. Let me set the context to this discussion that we are having today, and I wish to provide two perspectives. One is historical, and the other contemporary, and finally, a conclusion. Pandemics have contributed to the rise of great powers in the past. As most of you would know, in the Peloponnesian War with Sparta, Athens struck by plague in about 430 BC. This outbreak of typhoid from North Africa decimated the Athenians, depleted its military, and took the life of Pericles, its most effective leader. Athens, weakened by the contagion, settled for temporary peace in 421 BC. When the fighting resumed, Athens was defeated, and importantly, its democratic form of governance was overthrown by the victorious Sparta. I just wanted to share first how the shift of power took place. In the present context, we have a fairly different setting. All democracies have evoked emergency style of governance. There's hardly any difference between democracy and autocracy. Let me cite some examples where the division between autocratic and democratic forms of governance is getting diffuse. The first is Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who was granted extraordinary powers by the Hungarian parliament, the power to rule by decree to combat the coronavirus pandemic for as long as he sees fit. The second is in Philippines, where Rodrigo Duterte, the president, was granted sweeping new emergency powers over the country's healthcare system, which could be extended past 3 months. Third, France, Italy, and UK have all gone into varying states of lockdown, although the crucial difference is that their governments have set definite time limits and promised regular intervals of expansion of their power in monitoring the lockdown. A host of other democratic countries, including Israel, South Korea, have joined China and Iran, who have sought to track coronavirus patients using cell phone data. Several European countries are also reportedly considering the same. To us, what makes the difference is the quality of leadership in all these debates, whether it is autocratic or democratic or totalitarian. At Synergia, we look at 4 quintessentials. One is the empathy, the consistency in messaging and the willingness to accept challenges. Second is the nature of leadership. We need leaders who can constantly look for innovative solutions. And third, leadership must be seen more as a privilege, far bigger than ourselves, so that you don't want to hang on to power when you cannot deliver. Finally, you got to be grounded. Leaders must have the right sensors, or they must pick up the right sensors and act early with a clear vision. Now, I've put these 4 thoughts, and let me share some examples which will adhere to them. The first is the preemptive style of leadership of Vu Duc Dam, the Vice Minister of Vietnam. On 25th January 2020, the Prime Minister of Vietnam declared a war on Corona. Even though at that time the spread of the virus was confined to China and no cases were reported in Vietnam. With the help of the Communist Party of Vietnam, the whole nation, including its security forces, military, and civilian government were mobilized on a war footing to contain the spread of the virus. These measures were imposed with nationalistic fervor and most importantly accepted by the people at large. Vice Minister Vu Duc Dam was seen as the face of the campaign and is still being acknowledged as a hero. Vietnam has reported only around 185 cases as on date with no deaths. Second, the proactive leadership of Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, at the national level, and Mrs. Shailaja, whom many of you would not have heard, the health minister of a state of Kerala at the local level. The Indian Prime Minister demonstrated proactive leadership by his bold decision to lock down the whole country for 3 weeks from 25th of March to 14th of April. I do agree, concede that there are many problems that have come after that, but probably that was the only decision that he could take at that point in time because not knowing what would happen. The PM also showed demonstrable statesmanship by reaching out to other world leaders, including the G20. At the state level, Kerala, which is in the very south of India, the 63-year-old minister continues to be the face of Kerala's pandemic control measures. The minister is credited for innovative community surveillance, including home quarantine with mobile phone monitoring and flow charting of patients for travel and social visits. She will also be remembered for empathy, for providing the school midday meal to children at home when all the schools were shut down. And here is an interesting insight. She is a member of the Communist Party of India, Marxist. Finally, the reactive leaderships of Giuseppe Conte, Prime Minister of Italy, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of UK, and President Donald Trump of the US, which Julie has already referred to. The Italian government were perhaps unaware or unresponsive to the threats until 20th February 2020. It is also unfortunate that the Italian Prime Minister chose to impose the quarantine in a very secretive manner and with a dramatic announcement. A more transparent approach and a progressive manner of quarantining may have prevented the exodus. The British government's delayed and reactive, some people say flippant response to the threat, is perhaps the primary reason for the spread of pandemic amongst its 66 million population. The US president has been accused of downplaying the threat by publicly stating that community spread virus was not inevitable, even after senior health officials had warned otherwise. Finally, let me conclude by saying that there is an ideological element to the debate that we are having today. To deal with the COVID-19, the autocratic Communist Party of China initially tried to hide the outbreak, which only made matters worse. But after a slow start, China imposed draconian measures and appears to have wrestled the disease under control. Now onlookers are watching to see whether democratic countries like United States and EU will be able to better navigate the crisis. To me, the success or failure of the US/EU versus the Chinese response will partly shape the global perception about the relative efficacy of the democracy versus autocracy debate to handle pandemic and other major crises in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Toby. Also very enriching. Actually, I will stay with you and then ask you a question on, I think it's very important that, as you underlined, the size of India, meaning that states have sort of different reactions to this, and you gave some examples from Kerala. Are there others of those? Do you feel that there's like, you can, as you potentially can in the US as well, single out different states for taking different approaches that seem more efficient than others during this sort of, I know the lockdown is national, but as you mentioned, the examples of, for example, keep providing meals for schools and for school children and so on. So it's quite sort of different. So if there are any other examples you want to share with us, that would be interesting from sort of different ways, also accommodating to the Indian reality that a lot of people anyway live very closely together. Washing your hands all the time is maybe some places a luxury, and other innovative sort of solutions to some of these issues.
Okay, let me try to share another insight. If you look as a strategy to contain a pandemic, one of the most efficient ways is to monitor the primary healthcare unit in every state or every region. And this is the biggest indicator. We're not talking about big hospitals. Where we look at and where the southern states more were able to control it a little better, I feel, is because of the robust primary healthcare system. So people don't necessarily have to look at the test. They just have to look at if there are any spikes in, let's say, pulmonary infections at these primary healthcare centers. If there is a spike, that means there is a much higher chance that we are facing serious issues with this COVID virus. As long as the primary virus infection is nothing much, the spike is not there, then we know, yes, COVID is a virus, but perhaps we are building some amount of immunity to it. And in a larger way, we believe that in a country like India, we have to get immunized. We don't have the ability to test 1.3 billion. It is going to be so expensive. So we will have to look at what is being done at the most primary level of healthcare. And that's where India lives, if you exclude the cities. So you have probably a good strategy to lock down the cities, but slowly you will find that we will have to open up and see that this is one of the strategies which the Africans used in tackling Ebola. They tackled Ebola in their homes. And I always say, why can't we tackle COVID in our homes the same way we tackled measles, mumps, and chickenpox? The difference was when you had measles, mumps, and chickenpox, there was a symptom. So if you go out, your friends and neighbors would immediately tell you, go back home. Whereas in COVID, you don't have the situation. People don't know. So I'm just saying it will be much easier and a much more practical solution for a country like India to see whether we can contain it in our homes and build the immunity. Yes, the older people will be at risk, so you will have to provide for some, special room for them, like how we did when we were down with measles and chickenpox many years ago, and see whether to see, because I do agree, most of the countries in the world are talking about lockdowns. My worry is what next after that, and the worry is there for India. What do you do after this?
Thank you, Tobby. I just wanted, for people who maybe just tuned in here, Jonas Parello-Plesner, with the Alliance of Democracies Foundation here in Copenhagen, to on top of both of your great interventions with a couple of things here from Europe and some general pointers. One, I think it's important for our democracies that the steps that are taken, as both of you were underlining, we are under emergency in all our countries right now. So democracies, in a sense, are curbing civil rights. I think the important distinction is, are these temporary and are they proportional? I think that's really where we have to sort of keep vigilant. So when Hungary is, as was also underlined, is suddenly making parliament indefinite out of the game, then you have a big problem. When sort of disinformation, which is real and should be curbed, but when that's used to sort of put draconian fines possibly on people, which will potentially also limit freedom of expression, that again seems to be wrong, consider the principle of proportionality. And that's also where, back to the question of China, as several of you addressed, I think had there been freedom of expression and freedom of the media in China, we would likely have seen a different situation first in China and also globally. I mean, the fact that we had Chinese doctors already warning us in late December about this is a new type of sort of corona SARS virus, but being sort of shut down by the local security police because there was a big in Wuhan, sort of local communist party gathering in the middle of January, which was more important. And China even supplied the WHO with information in still mid-January that they had no clear evidence of human-to-human transmission, even though the spread was already starting beyond sort of China. So I think that's why, another example of why our sort of civil liberties are so important to sort of keep on to in this crisis. I think on democracies, from a perspective from where I am in Copenhagen, here the government and the prime minister took steps gradually. I think that in a democracy helps with sort of the public consent and accountability. So we had a sort of succession of press meetings called by the prime minister, and to a certain degree, you would already start knowing what's coming next. The first people were asked to sort of work at home, then gradually restaurants and places were closed and changed only so that you could do takeaway. Then it was restriction that you can only gather maximum 10 people, and in general you should stay 2 meters away from each other. And seeing this from a democracy where Denmark often sort of scores highly on trust in government, I think that has made it possible to take actually quite sort of strong steps at the same time as still allowing all freedom of expression and discussion about the government step. There's been, I would say, discussion about 2 steps in particular. One has been that we were the first or among the first in Europe to close down borders, and this was done a little bit without sort of a lot of European coordination. So in that sense, a very sort of national response. The second has been on testing, as you were referring to as well, where our health authorities initially said, well, it's more important just to have the sort of the severe cases of corona treated in hospital, and it's not that important to sort of test in the broader population. That came under a lot of criticism and is sort of now being reversed, but does show, I think, in democracies, even though I suppose Julia and I said it can be messy, that you do have that long-term sort of buy-in when you get populations behind it. Julia evoked sort of in the US with the Defense Act, sort of taking steps like these, you need to sort of prepare the public and in that case companies, that this is something we're now moving into a sort of different phase. So I think that's maybe also why in the initial phase that democracies can appear sort of more messy, but I would argue that the long-term resilience is also there because you have the population on board for what you do. I would also, on the question of China in Europe, agree with Julie that a week ago all the headlines were in particular in sort of US media about how China is now sort of buying up Europe through sort of mask diplomacy by handing masks. I think that was partly due to a very slow start by the EU. Now we do have a lot of intra-European solidarity. We see German planes land in Italy, pick up corona patients that can then be treated because there is capacity still in German hospitals. So all of this now by far dwarfs anything that China has done. So I think we're already a little bit out of that sort of scenario. And I would also, to be some sympathy with Italy, understand that when they the first days didn't see the sort of the European concrete help flood in, and China was there with an offer, of course, you sort of accept that. And now we also have, I would say, a bigger international cooperation on this. Taiwan has just yesterday announced a sort of big donation of masks to Europe. So I think we're seeing countries all over the globe sort of stepping up on this, so that it's not just China. So I think that's also sort of encouraging sign. So those were, you know, some of the things I just wanted to add to the debate. And now I will start here. Adding questions. Well, the first one I have up here is, how do we deal with countries such as Hungary that depart from our ideals? Anders Storgård, chairman of the Young Conservatives in Denmark. So it's a question from Denmark. Well, I can chip in initially, and then we'll ask Julie and Tobby to chime in as well. I mean, I think basically we should, even though it's a crisis, it should be the same response as has it not been a crisis, that we keep sort of monitoring the situation. Hungary has already a procedure in the European Union looking at its democracy and its fundamental rights. And this, of course, in my view, completely accelerates that. So there's an EU process, then I hope there is an international name and shame effort of basically telling the Hungarians that this is not the way to go, even though it's a crisis. And you have an opposition now. I think it's also bad for Hungary, because you then now have a divided country heading into the pandemic, that you have Orban, who definitely has it's a majority democracy, does have a majority and keeps winning elections. So I think that's an important point to remember, but with very scant sort of respect for freedom of the press and for sort of what does the minority say. And in my view, in these times of crisis, this is where, including in a democracy, even though there are political differences between parties, is when you sort of try to get together. So I also think for Hungarian society, it's a bad situation heading in with an opposition that is, of course, against these steps by Orban. Julie, would you want to chip in on this?
Yeah, I would just say, I think there's a couple of difficulties in tackling what Orban is doing. I mean, the first is we're all busy and distracted and dealing with the crisis ourselves. So this is truly a global pandemic. And so it's hard to focus not only on what you're doing at home and ensuring that your own citizens are safe and sound, but keeping your eyes open and monitoring the rest of the world simultaneously for these types of power grabs. It's extreme challenge right now for many other democracies around the world. Secondly, when you do see them, when you open your eyes and it catches your attention, you have a tendency to assume that it's short term, that this is something that Orban is doing that's awful. But I think we all kind of look the other way and hope that maybe at some point that country or Orban himself could reverse course. And I think that's a very dangerous assumption, because of course, a lot of the measures that are put forward in a crisis with a sense of urgency can easily become permanent and lasting policy. And we've seen that here in the United States. Post 9/11 is a good example, where we made changes. Some of them were reversed by the Obama administration, some were not. And you get used to things. And lastly, the European Union obviously has struggled with this for years. This isn't the first time that they've had to deal with changes in Hungary that they found disturbing and counter to the values that the EU holds dear. I think the EU looks internally and thinks, well, it doesn't have much of a toolkit in this regard. There are some things it can do, but the fundamental problem is it can't really vote Hungary off the island. And so trying to determine what measures they can take, either suspending them, in the parliament, or naming and shaming campaigns, or tying these changes to resource decisions. There are some tools, but of course, for an institution that operates largely by consensus, it's not easy to pursue some of them. these. So these are extremely difficult challenges to manage. And I think Orban knows that and sees a window of opportunity here that he can walk right through.
Excellent. Actually, Julie, I'll stay with you because I just saw that Anders Storgård that I just had another question before I go down to some other people asking questions, which I thought was interesting in a US context. Has our free trade with authoritarian regimes such as China left our supply chain too vulnerable in cases like the coronavirus? And should we therefore pursue a strategy where we increase free trade in the free world while increasing it with authoritarian states as a matter of security and a carrot and stick strategy? I think that's a very interesting question coming from Europe that's also been grappling with the 5G question, Huawei and national security, and whether this even is a bigger question on supply chains, also on something as medical tools, which nobody would have thought about prior to this as a sort of national security issue.
No, and it's interesting because there has been this longstanding debate about 5G and the potential vulnerabilities that societies are putting themselves, vulnerable situations that societies are putting themselves in by relying on Huawei and Chinese technology to pursue these 5G new networks. And I think there's been a pretty dramatic division of opinion on that, with the United States saying, well, you never know, they could have a kill switch, you don't want to be vulnerable, and Europeans kind of saying, well, how realistic is that, and would they really do something like that? Could they do something like that? Is it something we can live with because we already have Huawei in our 4G networks? And so this little debate has been, as it turns out, a microcosm of now this much bigger debate around the world about supply chains. And it has opened up that debate. We're having it here in the United States. It's fierce in Washington. I feel it. I see it. I hear it. Lots of really tough questions being asked about whether or not we should also revisit. We rely on China for so much. And so this is going to be part of the debates going forward, whether or not it brings democratic societies together to pursue trading arrangements that would essentially serve democratic interests or the interests of democratic nations, separate from a reliance on autocracies, or whether or not we just carry on and try to put safeguards in place to ensure that our national stockpiles are adequately equipped. I mean, this is one of the fundamental questions. And in terms of kind of the earth-shattering effects that this crisis can have on our democracies, I think you've really hit the nail on the question, the nail on the head. This question hits the nail on the head. I don't think any of us can predict what the answer is, but it will fundamentally shift some of those other debates like 5G in the future.
Great. And I have a question from Scott Young that's for the whole panel. Can you comment on any differences or degrees of effectiveness in COVID-19 responses between federal and unitary democracies? In addition to India and the US, which Toby mentioned, Canada, Germany, and Switzerland are three other federal states that come to mind where there are asymmetric COVID-19 responses as a result of robust subnational governments, Bavaria, Quebec, British Columbia, Switzerland. So that's actually an interesting sort of question, whether we see any, as Julie, you started, and maybe here I'll start with you, Toby. You both live in really large democracies, but which are also systems where, of course, the states have and both of you had mentioned examples of states reacting sort of differently to this, and there's both the federal level. So can we say anything yet about that, sort of between federal democracies versus unitary democracies and some of the then the subnational experiences? Toby, what's your thought on this?
Yeah, I would probably try to make a sort of a pitch on the fact that when you have very large countries with very diverse set of people, and they are not the same, they are small countries within countries, it will be very difficult to bring in a sort of a unitary form of governance, because the style, the leadership, everything will depend, and people are more comfortable dealing with more compact units of government. And we see that perhaps in India and in many other countries around this region, that are, the effectiveness of how they look at the problem and tackle it depends on the individual style of leadership. And I feel that some of them are more proactive, some are a little reactive. So it's something which would be too early for me personally to comment, because COVID is still 6 to 9 months away till we see some sort of a final resolution of this problem. And until then, we can only take empirical evidences that we have collected from the past.
Julie, do you want to chip in on this, on the sort of the federal? Then I have another question here. I don't have a name on how much do China and Russia collaborate to spread a narrative that autocrat systems is superior to effectively deal with a serious crisis like this pandemic? Maybe I'll try an initial sort of stab at that. I think China and Russia have been, in general, collaborating much more. And what we've seen as an interesting, for people that follow disinformation issues, is that the Chinese have actually here used what we would call the sort of the Russian playbook, where traditionally Chinese methods of influence interference go through other means, but we've seen it here on social media, where on Twitter, where China and Chinese officials have been spreading 2-3 rumors. One, that it should be the US Army that developed the virus. One, that it actually perhaps developed in Italy earlier than in China. And all of that just to sort of spread confusion and about sort of the origin, which is again something we've seen Russia do from the 2016 elections in US social media, to sort of exacerbate sort of different issues that are contentious and just provide different kinds of sort of conspiracy theories. But this is the first time we've seen China do it, where it's normally the other way around, that China has a very sort of top-down narrative coming, of course, from the Communist Party that it wants to sort of promote, and it promotes that through state media. So this is an unusual sort of use of the Russian playbook. I would say now that I think the two sort of collaborate right now less, because Russia, that was initially also a little bit sort of arrogant in that, with statements from Putin that it was unaffected completely by Corona. I think the virus is also spreading in Russia, showing some of the strains in their system. So I think we've heard sort of less propaganda on their side. But that would be my my reply. Anybody else on the panel that wants to chip in on that one?
A quick one, Jonas, I'll just say that, this spreading of fake doctored news has been there in the past. We had stories that came up from the time of the Spanish flu and even before. So these are all, asymmetric methods of destabilizing or doing things. And I think the democratic world must be resilient enough to face this, because this is a reality. And I think there is enough resilience in our systems to look at this and find ways to, deter it without actually going into conflicts.
Yeah, that's actually links well with one of the next questions I have here on the list from Mr. Troutner. Dear panelists, what is the risk of Chinese and Russian autocrats losing economy and public support at home seek to compensate with bold revisionist military policies and action? Is post-corona international security instability a serious risk? I think, Julie, that is just in your national security lane. There will be a presidential election later this year. I have no doubt what candidate that you're rooting for. If you were advising him now, is that what's likely to face whoever becomes president in January 2021, is actually a political potential fallout from this? Would that be one of the sort of danger signs that you saw ahead as well?
Well, it is a part of the playbook that we've seen before in the past, that when autocracies are facing challenging situations from their public, when they're facing protests or discontent or frustration with the government's ability to deliver, it's very convenient for them to create an international crisis. It's something that works well for them. The public often rallies around their respective flag in the face of a crisis, particularly one that portrays Russia or China as the victim. That really helps kind of right set public opinion when it's kind of going off the rails. So depending on kind of how those governments find themselves struggling in the wake of this crisis, I think this is a very real question that we should watch closely for any opportunities that they seize on to provoke some sort of conflict, how they're going to use their defense forces and their global posture more broadly. I mean, just look at North Korea. North Korea obviously sees an opportunity that the world is distracted. And so we have a leader there that wants to do what it can to either destabilize the region or do a little saber rattling, which is, again, to be expected. The interesting question that's paired with that trend now is, as Europe and the United States and other democracies around the world cope with which will no doubt be a financial crisis, will they make a decision to ease up on defense spending? I mean, we've just had a period of time now since 2014 where European defense spending budgets have been going up. And we could now see a situation where these governments in Europe in particular feel the need to go down to find resources to allocate towards public health. And if that happens, we'll now have even greater readiness challenges inside Europe. Russia could be watching that quite closely and determine that it's a good time to just dip their toe in the pool, maybe send a few forces across the border in a Baltic state or in Central and Eastern Europe, and sow divisions and create doubt about NATO's ability to respond. That would be a play that would be fairly predictable in my mind. But there are all sorts of other scenarios in the Middle East and elsewhere. So this is something that should be on the minds of any national security professional, whether they're currently serving the Trump administration or potentially in a future Democratic administration.
Thank you, Julie. Toby, I'll turn to you. I think there's a question from Sonakshi Gopi. So I think that's an Indian name, but anyway, it's a good question. What measures can be taken to prevent a global economic cripple like in 2008 and 9? And what changes, addition can be made to individual nations' public health policies to combat further pandemics? Since you're the one with us with most sort of pandemic experience, I thought this question should go to you.
Yeah, let me first try to answer the economic question. Okay, we are in a very peculiar situation where normally when we tip into recession, what governments do is provide stimulus. And stimuluses are very helpful when there is a problem in the demand side. Here, we don't have a problem in the demand side. The problem is in the supply side. All the supply chains are broken. So when you have a problem on the supply side, you can't give. I mean, giving a fiscal stimulus is not going to help. So this I see is the larger problem that we will have to solve as economies, because we were very much living in a world where we had integrated supply chains. And nobody produced everything. And that is how, if you look at some of the most valuable companies that was built in the last 20 years, they're all supply chain companies. I mean, companies that leverage supply chains, build their own intellectual property, and created wealth. Okay, Apple is one of them. And when Apple made their first iPod, the cost of all the components was only about $19, and they were selling it at something over $120. So this is something that world has to work together to fix, and conflicts won't help to fix it, because if you look at China as a supplier of parts and components of bulk drugs, I mean they still are so vital. Okay, The second part is, can we do something to combat pandemics? And I go back to what Julie was saying. Okay, what the earlier administrations, I don't want to pick up names because I stay away from that, but the earlier administration had prepared. They had spent a definite amount of money, and I heard one of the former national security advisors before this administration came that there was a detailed briefing that pandemics were a big threat, but somehow people ignored it. Okay, so while I don't wish to go political, all I want to say is, again, if you want to combat pandemic, whether in India or anywhere else in the world, we got to work together and we got to invest a lot of money on technology. Even if, I will conclude, even if we are going to produce vaccines with the traditional model based on egg yolk, it is going to take a humongous amount of time to produce it. Which means that even if somebody finds a vaccine, and if the demand is going to be like, you got to give vaccines to all the Americans, where will these medicines come to the South? It will take years before somebody can supply the medicines to India or southern states. So there is a lot of emphasis that we need to put, and pandemics are here to stay. It is going to be, it could either be a low-cost biological weapon, it could be a disease, it could be, but it is going to be with us, and it will keep coming. So all we need to do is, as responsible governments, to combine research at industry level or government level to make sure that we are ahead of the curve, and then pray for the best.
Thank you, Tobby. I'm taking here our last question. Do you think the fact that social media platforms are now taking on more of a role to police content marks a change that would impact on how they deal with disinfo and election meddling in the future? That's, of course, a question I think of all our three lanes that we're quite interested in. I mean, I will let maybe Julie go first, and then Tobby, and then I can also say a couple of thoughts on that.
Well, I don't know. I mean, the social media platforms are going through kind of a wave of criticism and praise here in the United States. I mean, they seem to be increasingly aware of their important role on multiple fronts. But I think people also see that business is up and booming, and that this is a great opportunity. I mean, no one's doing as well as Facebook right now, or you think about Google or even Amazon, which isn't kind of social media, but there are a lot of tech companies in the United States that have just had tremendous surges. I think there's an open-ended question about where this takes us ultimately, what their role is in public health, what their role is in dismantling and countering disinformation, and how they use those platforms. I mean, that is kind of a chapter that's definitely unfolding in real time each and every day. I see some things that I find reassuring, and other days I think, why aren't they doing more to manage some of these challenges? So we already have been in a prickly position with kind of the policy community here in Washington and the Silicon Valley folks out west. There's natural tension in that relationship. I would not predict that tension to ease, even if they take some measures that we find to be helpful. I think the tension in that space will continue to mount. I don't know, that's just my guess, but curious what you both think.
Tobby?
What we see in social media, to me, is here to stay, because we live, whether it is in a democracy or autocracy, or more in democracy, in a very polarized atmosphere. And so it is extremely profitable, I would use the word, for people who operate in the social media to create narratives which are suitable for them. And whatever narrative they create, extreme right, center, left, extreme left, there is a market for them. And if you look like in countries where you have significant amount of population, even if you get 10% of the population on your side, You have a good economic model. And I would only say that is what motivates people. I remember, Julie, I'm sure you know that there was an attempt by a newspaper or a news group in the US to move from extreme right to the center, but they lost 10 to 12% of their circulation. And then it didn't make sense. So that's the same in most countries, even in India. There is a market, there is a business, and people are making money out of it.
Thank you, Toby. I was also going to chime in on that one, but noticing time and we have a hard stop here, then I would just say with Julian's words, it's too early to say on sort of echoing Julie. I want to sort of thank our two panelists, Toby Simon, founder and president of Synergia Foundation, a think tank based in Bangalore in India, for bringing us your perspective. I want to thank Julie Smith, director at the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund in Washington, DC, and once again for also making an early start together with us. This is definitely not going to be sort of the last. So for listeners out there, we're looking at also bringing to you Taiwan's experiences with handling the COVID-19, and particularly sort of the application of tech and sort of the content of citizens, and looking to bring in Audrey Tang, Taiwan's digital minister, at another Alliance of Democracies virtual session on this. So I would say to everybody listening out there in different time zones, stay tuned. There will be more. And we have a lot sort of to share around the world. And then last but not least, remember all what the WTO is saying, at this time, it's a civic duty to keep social distancing. So watching webinars is a good way to pass time, and wash your hands and all the other suggestions. So with that, I want to bring this to a close and say thank you to all of you out there listening to us today. Goodbye.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.